We are back, and we are joined now by Zachary Foster, historian of Palestine. He received his PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University, proprietor of the Palestine in Your Inbox / Palestine Nexus newsletter. Zachary, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Everyone should follow Zach. Do you go by Zach or Zachary? What do you prefer?
Zach is great.
Zach, everyone should follow Zach on Twitter because, I've followed you for years, but especially in this moment, having your expertise as somebody who studied Palestine in particular is very needed. And your work really is all about preserving Palestinian history, which, we spoke to Ilan Pappy on this program before, one of the Israeli new historians. We're just at the very beginning, I think, of a more mainstream, broader cultural understanding, historical understanding of what Palestinian history really, really is. And there are still efforts, though, to destroy that. I mean, every university in Gaza has been bombed at this point. One was a controlled demolition. So in terms of this moment for preserving Palestinian history, what are your kind of major goals and your overriding thoughts about this particular moment for your work?
Just to start with the problem statement, for more than a century, the Palestinian people have been completely erased from media in the United States. Going back long before World War II, there have been studies done showing that basically the Arabs don't exist. The Palestinian Arabs do not exist in Western media in the United States. The problem persists in the 1970s. A study came out in the publication Plus 972 a couple of years ago, showing how from 1970 to 2019, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, and a couple of other publications, there was a lot written about Palestinians, but almost none of the articles published about Palestinians were written by Palestinians. In the New York Times, it was about 1%. So the Western media has basically left Palestinians out of the conversation. And so I think instead what you have is mainstream media, cable news, New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, all of the major publications that cover foreign affairs. They do not give Palestinians in the words of Edward Said, the Palestinians do not have permission to narrate. And I think it's my goal to bring Palestinians, Palestinian history back on the table. So my website, Palestine Nexus, we publish documents, collections of documents, the most recent of which is a collection called the Gaza Collection, which is, I purchased many hundreds of documents, probably about 600 documents total from an antique dealer in Gaza. And his name is Salim El-Rais. And he's a refugee now, struggling to survive just like everyone else in Gaza. But I was able to purchase many hundreds of documents from him. So we have the Gaza Collection. These are documents dating all the way back to the Ottoman period. Property records, business transactions, personal papers, letters, family papers that Salim El-Rais went around Gaza and collected. And so that is all available for free to download on PalestineNexus.com. And I think more generally, I think my goal is to try and make Palestine history more accessible to broader audiences. And so what I do in my writing, my newsletter, on Twitter, is to try to demystify this conflict, right? It's quote unquote complicated, as all of these Western experts would have you believe, but in fact, it's actually not that complicated.
It's really not. Yes. It's quite easy. It's was imperialism, colonialism in the past. This is the modern version of it, and it's kind of a test, I think, of our the arc of moral progress, as democratic politicians like to refer to it, as to whether or not we recognize it as the reality that it is. So, I mean, I'm going to pick your brain then on some of these things that you are archiving, and Middle Eastern history and Palestinian history in particular. So for people that may be watching this for the first time and are not familiar with the history of the Palestinian people, Palestinian as an identifier, as a national identity, or a cultural identity, how did what are the first records of people identifying as Palestinian, and how that fit, I guess, into the broader Ottoman Empire as well?
Yeah, so the first instance of a Palestinian using that word in Arabic, Falastini or Falastiniyin, the plural, is in 1898. A guy named Khalil Beidas. He publishes a book. It's a translation of a Russian archaeologist's guide to the Holy Land. He translates it into Arabic, and he's using the word Palestinian to describe the Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine, and he uses that word throughout the book. You also have articles coming by Najib Nassar and Salim Kobain in 1901. They're publishing articles titled "A Palestinian Describes a Palestinian Town" in Arabic. In a journal called El Jamia, published in Alexandria. But even actually before that, if you go already starting in the 1870s and 80s, you have actually many English, German, and Russian sources who are describing the people of Palestine as Palestinians. I think one of the common myths about the origins of the Palestinian people is that the Palestinians only started to identify as such in response to Zionist immigration and Zionist land purchases. That's a myth. These first Palestinians who started to call themselves Palestinians, why did they start to do that? Well, you have all of these schools opening up around the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, right? You have Ottoman schools, you have German schools, you have Russian schools. That's the school that Khalil Beidas went to, as well as Najib Nassar and Salim Kobain. So they're going to these schools. They're learning from textbooks called The History of Palestine, The Geography of Palestine. There are maps of Palestine posted on the walls. They're taken out of their home environments, and they're living in these boarding schools. Lo and behold, they start to, as well as being taken on trips around the Holy Land, visiting the holy sites in Jerusalem and Nazareth and wherever else. Lo and behold, by the first decade of the 20th century, they're all calling themselves Palestinians.
Right, and then the turn of the century happens. The Zionist project begins to kind of unfold at this point. There are the Balfour Declarations in 1917, but my understanding is that before that there were some Russian Jewish emigres that had begun moving to the area by that point as well. When did the Zionist project kind of begin in earnest, and how did that coincide with certain emigration to the area?
I think the first wave of Zionist immigration to Palestine traditionally is considered to be 1882. Maybe you could say 1878. But for the first 4 decades of Zionist immigration to Palestine, from the 1880s to World War I, you only get a few tens of thousands of Palestinians, a very small number. They're still less than 15%. On the eve of World War I, they're still less than 15%.
10 to 15% Palestinians, you meant Jewish immigrants or emigres. Yeah.
Excuse me, apologies, I misspoke.
Just wanted to make sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the country, okay, so let's go back to 1870, sort of before Zionism. There is no Zionism in 1870. The land of Palestine is 85% Muslim, 10% Christian, 5% Jewish, roughly. By the eve of World War I, the Zionists have only a few tens of thousands of Zionists have immigrated to Palestine. The real uptick in Zionist immigration to Palestine does not happen until the 1930s. I mean, even as late as 1929, 1930, there's a big earthquake in Palestine. There's the disturbances of 1929. And even into the early 1930s, 1931, 1932, the Zionists are talking about how this project is failing. This project is not going as planned. There are not enough Zionists, are still less than 20% of the population. How is it you establish a Jewish country in a land that is 80% non-Jewish? Ask yourself that question. And by the way, all the Zionists did ask themselves that question. And they all, for the most part, almost every major Zionist thinker from 1880 to 1948 asked that question. And the majority of them landed on a similar answer, which was, well, these people, they have a strong national identity. They have deep roots in the country, and they're not going to leave voluntarily. And so there was basically only one real practical solution to solving the problem of the Arab question, as it was known then. It was transfer. That's how they called it back then. Now we would call that ethnic cleansing, which is exactly what happened in 1948. But to answer the question, yes, the real uptick in Zionist immigration did not happen until after 1933, right? It was basically when Hitler rose to power in Germany that you saw massive wave of Zionist immigration. In 1933 up until 1936, you get 30, 40, 50,000 Zionists immigrating to Palestine every year in the mid-1930s.
And at that point, I mean, what the Zionist project, how can you contextualize that within rising nationalism in the 20th century in Europe? Because based on my reading of some of your work, that's very central to understanding it, because that nationalism also led us in part into two world wars, but it was very much so at kind of the core of what Zionists wanted to do in what is now Israel.
That's exactly right. You have this ideology spreading around Europe in the 19th century called nationalism that says that all the peoples of Europe are nations, and thus they all need their own national homeland. And the Jews are basically left out of that project of nationalism, because the Jews in Austria are told they're not Austrians, they're Jews. And the French Jews are told, no, they're not French Jews, they're Jews. And the same is true in the Russian Empire. They're told they're not Russian Jews, they're Jews. And so they fail to integrate, owing to the anti-Semitism and bigotry that they face in Europe. And so they ask themselves, okay, well, if we are Jews and we're not Germans and we're not French and we're not Russians, well, then what is our national homeland? And they settle on Palestine relatively quickly. They debate, there was a project to try and settle Jews in Sinai, in Argentina, and also in Africa, and I believe Uganda. But basically, very quickly, they realize that Jews won't actually move to those other places.
Right.
The only place that they can convince any number of Jews to move to actually try and build this Jewish state, this Jewish nation state, is in Palestine.
Right. And it really is these like European exports into the Middle East, one of nationalism based on that kind of identity, and then also colonialism, even though, of course, the Holocaust and the persecution faced by Jews in Europe and in Russia, as you say, is like the impetus for it. And it seems moral on its face within the context of what self-actualization or of what Jews were facing within that context, right? But then the context is, well, there were people living there, and here we go. We're going to just do a very European-style colonial nationalist project, but with all of this other kind of emotional weight behind it.
Make no mistake, the early Zionists, they saw themselves as colonizers. In fact,
they call themselves settlers, still to this day, by the way. But yeah,
to this day, I mean, really, in a very profound sense, one of the head of the Palestine office, the executive office in Palestine for the first decade and a half of the 20th century, Arthur Rupin. So he is born in Poland. And one of his first hire for that office is a German official who had previously worked in the German colonial administration that was in charge of transferring German citizens to Poland to try and create a German demographic majority in parts of Poland. And so he hired this guy. It's like, wow, this guy's perfect for the Zionist enterprise, because that's exactly what we're trying to do in Palestine, right? We're trying to transform the country from a demographic majority of Arabs, overwhelmingly, to a majority of Jews. So he hires this German colonial official into the Palestine office to help plan how you're going to actually transform the demography of Palestine. And then, of course, all of these Zionist institutions use that word, the Jewish Colonial Trust. The Zionist Colonial Trust, right? They're collecting money around Europe so that they can buy a plan in Palestine, right? The Jewish Colonization Society, they embrace as part of their self-conception is that they are colonizers. And in fact, they see themselves very much the same way that like Europeans saw themselves in South Africa and Australia and the United States. And they even draw very explicit comparisons to other European settler colonial movements.
Well, there's a reason that the Afrikaner government, before apartheid was overthrown, was very much joined at the hip with the Zionist project and the new government of Israel. I remember reading in the 70s kind of recently. But I guess now we can turn to 1948, the Nakba, the mass expulsion of Palestinians to create the Jewish state. What is the Nakba? What did that entail? And how did it lead to the creation of Israel and Palestine as we know it?
Yeah, so the Nakba is probably the single most important event, at least before 2023, in Palestinian history. It was the word itself just means catastrophe. it is used to describe the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948. And so just to back up a little bit, the British, they have occupied Palestine in 1920 and established this mandate for Palestine that lasts until 1948. And basically they decide after almost 30 years of colonial rule that, this project has failed. It's time to go back home. And basically they declare that they're going to leave Palestine. And so and then the United Nations adopts this the partition plan in 1947, in November 1947, and immediately after that plan is proposed, you see violence between Jews and Palestinians in Palestine, kind of a civil war from November 1947 until the war lasts until almost the end of 1948, really November, December 1948, and it's during that period of time from November 1947 up until let's say November 1948, in which the Zionist forces first they adopt a plan. It's called Plan Dalet, and that plan is basically a blueprint for establishing a Jewish state. And how do you establish a Jewish state in a land that is majority non-Jewish? Well, you remove the Arabs. And that was quite explicit in the plan. It was anyone is hostile to the Zionist forces who go town to town in February, March, April, and May of 1940. They're going town to town. They're expelling Palestinians from their homes. You get 40,000 Palestinians expelled from Lid in 1948. There's massacres in Tantura on the coast. Then in the Galilee in the fall of 48, they go up and expel hundreds of thousands of more Palestinians into Lebanon and Syria. So basically, the Nakba it's not only the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, but also the entire destruction of Palestinian society. Remember, it wasn't just that they expelled the Palestinians from their homes. It was that then they destroyed the villages so they couldn't come back to them. And then on top of that, they destroyed 500 Palestinian villages during the war. And then I think really the real kicker is that after the war ended, they continued to expel more Palestinians from their homes. It wasn't like the war ended, okay, peace with the Palestinians. No. They continued to expel something like 36 more Palestinian villages were depopulated after November 1948. So in other words, after the war ended. And then in the 2 years following the end of the war, so basically from the end of 1948 until 1950, you had all these Palestinian refugees trying to come home. Right? As refugees so often do at the end of a war, you go home. And in their attempts to go home, they were overwhelmingly unarmed. They were trying to reclaim property, trying to reclaim lost land, trying to see family, trying to reclaim animals, harvest crops in some cases. More than 1,000 unarmed Palestinians were slaughtered in the year after the war, in the 1 to 2 years after the war. So I think this is why it was such a catastrophe, because not only do you have so many massacres during the war, not only do you have 750,000 Palestinians become refugees during the war, but then you have many thousands of Palestinians massacred even after the war itself.
Yeah, I mean it's the Nakba, my producer Matt just said it's a continuous and present process. That's I think a great way to put it. It's very eerie, right? What we're witnessing at this current moment, and the exact tactics that you described there. So the Nakba happens 1948. The partition plan goes into place. The next kind of real milestone is based on, you're the historian, but based on my understanding, is the 1967 borders, which Israel has been in violation of for decades at this point. That really marks the moment where Israel decided we are not gonna comply with kind of like any international boundaries set to try to contain this process. What happens in 1967 and after?
Yeah, so the June 1967 war, a war that you could say was a culmination of tension between, let's say, Egypt and Israel, as well as Syria and Israel, and Jordan and Israel. And this boils over into a war in which Israel conquers and occupies Gaza, Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. And within a few weeks of the war's end, Israel annexes a massive swath of the West Bank. something like 70 or 80 square kilometers of basically the West Bank. It now calls East Jerusalem so that it can annex it. Within 2 weeks of the war's end, so we're talking June 18th, 19th, 1967, the Israeli cabinet makes a number of critical decisions. Number one, they decide that the eastern border with Jordan, so basically the Jordan River, is now Israel's eastern border. And that, which essentially means Israel made the decision to permanently occupy the West Bank indefinitely. They made that decision 2 weeks after the war ended. Okay, not even, maybe it was less than 1 week. They also decide that they don't really want Sinai, but they do want Gaza. And eventually they make this. This is incredible that they literally. This was a decision made in 56 years ago. The Israeli cabinet decided, we want to annex Gaza, but we need to figure out a way of expelling its residents first. That was a cabinet discussion. That was a decision that was made in June 1967. So, basically the decision was made. We want the land. We don't want the people that live on it. That's a very important thing for the Zionists, right? You want the land because Zionism is all about Jewish flourishing, Jewish self-determination, Jewish prosperity, right? Well, how do you prosper and flourish? Well, you conquer more land and you settle more people on it. This is all, especially the kind of the historic homeland of the ancient Israelite kingdom, right? Judea and Samaria, right? So this is very much like part of the core of Zionism is kind of settling the land. So you got to conquer it, then you occupy it, and then you settle it. And what do you do with the Palestinians? Well, if you can expel them, great. If you can't expel them, well, push them into smaller and smaller areas. Crowd them into, push them from Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, get them out of that land because that's the area Israel wants, push them onto Area A and B, which is only 40% of the West Bank, and then in Gaza, just keep crowding them into smaller and smaller areas, create a buffer zone, create Israeli settlements separating North Gaza from South Gaza. And that's basically what we've seen over the past 56 years.
So how much territory did Israel take in like the immediate aftermath of 1967 in violation again of the international borders drawn? And then when did like the West Bank and Gaza as the respective ghetto and open air prison of Palestinian people, / concentration camp, when did those kind of modern borders come to be?
Yeah, so in the immediate aftermath of the war, Israel, like I said, they annexed something like 70 square kilometers of the West Bank. They annexed it to Jerusalem and called it East Jerusalem, even though those villages were actually not part of Jerusalem before that period of time. And then they basically decide they're going to occupy Gaza and the West Bank indefinitely. And essentially, over the course of the 1960s and 70s, start to implement processes and procedures, and then you get the permit regime, and then you get the closure regime. But basically, it's a 56-year-long history of confiscating more land. Something like, I don't recall the exact figures, but a vast majority of the settlements are actually built on privately owned Palestinian land. So you confiscate land in various ways. The most popular way by the 1980s was declaring it state land. So first you declared state land, and then you build settlements on it. And then in many cases you have to push Palestinians off that land to build those settlements. In certain cases, the Israeli army even used chemical weapons. They poisoned a well, and they poisoned wells in the 1970s because they wanted to build an Israeli settlement. I believe it was near Salfit in the West Bank. But in any case, so Israel is conquering, confiscating land, demolishing homes. They are stripping Palestinians of residency rights, pushing them. So, for example, in East Jerusalem, 15,000 Palestinians have been stripped of their right to live in East Jerusalem. Why? Well, because they're born of the wrong religion and of the wrong nationality. That's basically the reason. And the same is true in the West Bank and Gaza. Over the, basically from 1967 until 1987, they expel 2,000 Palestinians from the occupied territories to outside. The same happens in the 90s. They try and expel 400 members of Hamas fighters. Hamas is carrying out all these attacks. And so they're like, oh, we know the solution. Let's expel all of Hamas to South Lebanon. By the way, that is a very tragic mistake on their part, because what ends up happening is Hamas and Hezbollah.
I was just about to say, how predictable. They join Hezbollah in Lebanon. Jesus Christ.
It's like exactly what happened with when the U.S. created all these prisons in Iraq after 2003, and basically it created these breeding grounds for ISIS in Iraq. The same is true with Israel. They push all these Palestinians out of Israel into Lebanon, or out of the occupied territories into Lebanon. Then, and lo and behold, you have this kind of newfound alliance between Hamas and Hezbollah,
which that is convenient also for Israel, by the way. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. So basically, it's a 56-year-long history of taking over more land, destroying more Palestinian homes, destroying Palestinian olive groves, expelling Palestinians from out of the occupied territories, stripping them of their residency status, denying them the right to family reunification, denying them the freedom of movement, denying them the right to vote for the government that controls their lives, i.e. the Israeli military, imposing a military regime on them that has a conviction rate in the military courts of 99.7%. I mean, that is life for Palestinians for 56 years.
Yeah, I mean, and when you say that the number 56 years over and over again, I mean that is so important to note, because that has been the reality up until this point. When we're continuously talking about October 7th, I mean, it's purely based, really, on the poverty and the deprivation of the Palestinian people and the extreme amount of arms and weaponry and wealth that is sent to Israel, and propped up by, and also nuclear weapons, by the way, most likely. And that has made it so that, like, that's the deadliest attack in 56 years of occupation and seizure of land and deprivation of rights and mowing the lawn. That's all that happened. I mean, that is almost a minor miracle that more Israelis have not been killed in this way.
I think that, I mean, if you go back to 1948, 1956, and look at how it is that this organization Hamas even came about, right? In 1948, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, he was expelled from his home at age 12. The other founder, the other co-founder of Hamas, Abdulaziz Rantisi, in 1956, when he was an 8-year-old boy in the Khan Yunis refugee camp in Gaza, the Israeli army, in their neo-colonial war together with Britain and France, they reoccupy Gaza. They occupy the Gaza Strip. They enter the Khan Yunis camp on November 3rd, 1956, grab every male above the age of 15, line them up in the city center, and execute them. It was a massacre. 150 to 200 Palestinians were massacred. He bore witness to that. As an 8-year-old boy, his uncle was massacred. Lo and behold, 20 years later, in the case of Abdulaziz Rantisi, and in the case of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, something more like 30 or 40 years later, they found the organization that carried out the attack on October 7th. So, I mean, just imagine how many 12-year-old boys have been made homeless. How many 8-year-old girls are witnessing the horrific violence, 30,000 Palestinians slaughtered in 3 months, the starvation now that is setting in. We're talking about the Israeli army using starvation as a weapon of war right now. You're talking mass displacement, mass suffering, overcrowded shelters, diseases spreading rampantly. I mean, how many of the kids in Palestine today are going to grow up with the hatred that is going to lead them to carry out all kinds of attacks against Israel in the future? I mean, my goodness, how could they not? I mean, what is Israel doing right now? It's setting itself up for decades and decades more violence. I mean, it's just so tragic thinking about kind of what is, it's what has happened is tragic. Thinking about what will happen in the future is just, it's honestly difficult to even comprehend.
Yeah. I mean, and we don't even know updated death tolls right now, because the entire health system in Gaza has completely collapsed. Their ability, and the ministry too, their ability to get anything out there. I mean, the rolling blackouts, it's been over a week of communication blackouts. We don't know. I go by Euromed Monitor numbers because they also count the presumed dead in their figures, but even the 25,000 dead number that are confirmed by like morgues and hospitals, that's not the full figure, but it's also going to be higher, the official death toll, soon, because the counting isn't even able to proceed in any way right now. Like, we are witnessing, let alone the people that are going to be maimed and never be the same for the rest of their lives based on the injuries that they've suffered and the family that they have lost. I guess, I'll wrap up here with you, Zach, just because I kind of want to bring us to the present day. Tomorrow we will get the ICJ injunction essentially ruling, which is just the first the first kind of like emergency measure put in place in if they're going to do it as they go over the next few years and look into South Africa's genocide case against Israel. One of the refrains you'll hear from Zionists about the case for the genocide case is like, oh, well, look at this population explosion. I mean, you can't be genociding a people when their population continues to increase. Now, putting aside the obvious, I think, rebuttal to that, which is that South Africa isn't actually contending that the genocide began before October 7th. They were contending that the ethnic cleansing and the conditions before the act of genocide began set up the genocide that is happening right now. But even so, that straw man about the population increase, as a historian of Palestine, what's your response to that?
Anybody who talks about population increases in a conversation about genocide is actually telling you they don't know what the legal definition of genocide is, according to the United Nations Genocide Convention of 48. That's what they're saying, right? Because it's there are 5 things that this convention defines as acts of genocide, right? So acts to commit with intent to destroy in whole or part a group, including killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily harm, right? So, and then of course declaring your intent. Intent is very important. You have to declare intent. Another condition, another one of the 5 acts would be making basically conditions of life, conditions that basically where you can't live. When you describe what the Genocide Convention calls a genocide, and then you look at what Israel is doing in Gaza, it's a textbook case of genocide,
Exactly.
according to Israeli scholar Raz Siegel. Literally, intent. How many pages of the ICJ case included statements made by senior Israeli political and military officials, starting from the prime minister, comparing the enemy to Amalek, the biblical people that the Israelites were instructed to destroy every man, woman, child, and ox of. You have the prime minister state not once but twice the enemy the enemy is Amalek, meaning you need to kill every single man, woman, and child. How much more direct evidence of intent to commit a genocide do you need? This is a textbook case. So you have the intent, then you obviously have making conditions of life impossible. So complete siege. There's hundreds of thousands.
The births part, preventing births, the hospital attacks, the NICU babies decomposing. There's 5 planks of that Article 2, and Israel clearly meets 4 of them.
Exactly right. So I don't know what the ICJ will, how the ICJ will rule tomorrow. What I do know is that regardless of what term we use to describe this, it is among the most horrific acts we've ever seen in all of human history. We are looking at the complete destruction of an entire society. Something that people are describing. Not even World War II, not even the horrific scenes coming out of World War II are even comparable. We're talking about 90+% of the population made homeless. We're talking about, million+ people starving to death. As you and I have this conversation right now, 1 million+ people are starving to death.
Yep. I think the problem is just like the Zionists, defenders of the Israeli government, aren't even contending with facts. They're operating from a might meets right kind of perspective. And for someone who's geriatric like Joe Biden and who cites Golda Meir as somebody who he deeply admires, and how her conversation with him back in the Senate in 1973 changed his perspective forever, it's like, okay, so we're on sentimentality, we're on raw emotion, we're on a false kind of misguided desires to have reparations for the Holocaust at the expense of another population. These figures seem to be not getting home to people, and that's what's maddening. But
Yeah, I mean, 100 days after October 7th, the president of the United States issues a statement in support and in sympathy with the Israeli victims and the Israeli victims only. I mean, the disconnect. Does he understand that 80% of young Americans call for a ceasefire? Does he understand that the 5 to 10 million American Muslims and Arabs are not going to vote for someone who's carrying on a genocide against the Palestinian people? Does he have any idea what he's doing? I mean, for his own self-interest, leaving aside the
Exactly.
Palestinians.
I don't know. Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here, Zach. But I really, really, if the audience hasn't gotten the sense already, Zach's newsletter is really, really important work, and archiving all of this is so essential. It's called the Palestine Nexus newsletter. You can sign up for it. You can read some of those documents that Zach outlined there for free on the website as well. We'll put a link to Palestine Nexus in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this. Zachary Foster, really, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, and I hope to have you on again soon.
Thanks so much for having me, Emma.